want to start by asking you about the impetus behind writing this book. When did you realize that this is the intervention you wanted to make, and what spurred that decision?
The real focus of this book became the post-ChatGPT era, the generative AI era as we know it. I had to think about what exactly LLMs added to this discussion, how they were different, how they were, through the development of new capabilities and things like that, how exactly they were changing the business's approach. And for me, the core reason from that point on was simply trying to understand what this flurry of activity, what it was all about. So if you follow the AI scene, industry, whatever, every single day, there's new models being released, new variants on these models, new research papers, new businesses, new applications, new capabilities, all sorts of different elements that are being added every single day. And it's just a chaos, really hard to understand exactly what's going on. So in writing this book, it was an attempt to try and generate a framework that would help us to understand what was going on. And one of the major challenges, I think, of writing the book was exactly that all of these new developments were occurring every single day. And it seemed like major transformations in the AI industry were happening monthly. So how do you write about something which is changing so constantly? That became a constraint on the writing process, in fact, and I think a really valuable constraint because it meant pinpointing exactly what was a sort of transitory phenomenon within the AI world, and what was the more fundamental dynamics which are going to last beyond the month or the 6 months that it takes to get the book out. So I think I've come up with a framework which tries to get at some of these fundamental drivers of the economic elements of the AI industry. One of the assumptions of the book is that AI is a general purpose technology. This builds upon variety of different economics work, which has been looking precisely at AI as a general purpose technology. We might contrast this with, for instance, approaches to AI, which say that it's complete nonsense, it's a stochastic parrot at best, that it's not actually going to contribute anything all that useful to the economy. And on the other hand, we might look at sort of the AGI discourse that sees within LLMs the rise of this new sort of synthetic intelligence. It completely transforms all of our economic understandings, and our classic concepts no longer work. And I think in between those two positions, you have this AI as a GPT sort of idea, or what's been called normal technologies. The idea here is that general purpose technologies have a few key characteristics. They tend to have massive impacts on the economy and on society, but they don't do so immediately. They take time to roll out, they take time to diffuse throughout an economy, throughout the society, and they often take decades for their full impact to really be felt. One of the key things for me about general purpose technologies is that there is this sort of distinction between the general technology itself and the sort of specific applications that are made of it. So if we look at, for instance, semiconductors as a GPT, the basic general idea of semiconductors, involves sort of an abstract schematic of transistors and things like that. The specific application, though, to the chips that go into your computer, the chips that go into GPUs, the chips that go into a car, the chips that go into your phone, those specific applications require all sorts of different adjustments to that general purpose in order for the sort of maximal utility of this idea to be brought out. So this distinction here between general and specific ends up being, I think, really important, because what the research on GPTs has shown in the past is that the inventors of a GPT, of a general purpose technology, find it really difficult to actually capture most of the value of that general purpose technology. And instead, most of the value ends up going to the people, the companies who are developing the specific and downstream applications of this idea. Now, I think what's happening within the big AI companies, to a more or less conscious degree, is an understanding that they want to capture the most value from this particular GPT. And to do so, they need to find ways to sort of capture some of this value, which is being produced by specific applications, being produced downstream. So I lay out in the book 4 different sorts of strategies. The first of these is an infrastructure strategy. This is companies like Amazon and Microsoft and Alibaba. The idea here is that they're going to capture most of the value of AI by capturing a little bit from every single use of AI. So they want to be the basic infrastructure that all of these AI applications are running on. There's all sorts of efforts then to increase the supply of AI on these infrastructures, but also to increase the demand for their particular cloud infrastructure. The focus of these infrastructure companies then is not on any particular model, no particular AI model, but instead on just maximizing AI usage in general. So I'll give one really interesting example. When DeepSeek came out and they released their really cheap R1 model, which, was produced in a much cheaper way than comparable Western models, loads of companies were really concerned about, does this mean this is all a huge waste of money to be spending billions training these models? And Microsoft CEO said, no, this is great. Because for him, it meant more use of AI. It meant more rents going to this infrastructure. So there's a certain economic structure there, which determines what they're interested in, what they benefit from. The second key strategy is the frontier strategy. And this is companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, and also DeepSeek as well is another key example. And here the idea is that you're going to capture value by producing the very best model, which no competitor can match. And then you can build an ecosystem of other companies who are dependent upon you. And then you can become the hub of that ecosystem. The same way in which, for instance, Apple has become the hub of an ecosystem of various developers around it. And it manages to capture huge amounts of value through that surrounding ecosystem by being the hub of it. So a similar thing then goes for these frontier companies. The risk for them is that if they don't get the best model, and that if everybody starts to have similar capabilities of these models, they end up competing not on the quality of the model, but instead on the price of the model, which leads to these price wars, which leads to low profit margins or negative profit margins for them. The third key strategy is conglomerates. And this is a very unique strategy that I think only two companies really are doing. It is Google and Huawei in China who are carrying out some version of a conglomerate strategy. Here, the basic response to the challenge of capturing value through a GPT is that they're going actually out into those downstream applications and building models and applications themselves. So here, they're not just building that general purpose model, they're also building healthcare models and education models and chemistry models and mathematics models and biology models. And in Huawei's case, they've got a mining model. So all of these different particular downstream applications that then allow these companies to capture the value quite directly through these downstream applications. So that is a really unique approach, and only two companies are doing it. It's unique, I think, because it's really challenging. You need to have, as a company, these capacities to understand what's needed in each of these different markets, each of these different industries. You also have to have the capacity to not just build that frontier model, which costs huge amounts of money, but then also the capacity to go out and spend money building these more niche approaches as well. So it's a relatively rare thing, but I think it's also the most worrying because it means there is a real extension of these companies into all these different markets in a very significant way. The last strategy that I want to talk about is the open strategy. And this was most closely associated with Meta when I was writing the book. DeepSeek came along and has also become a core part of it. Meta seems to be backing away from it at the moment since I published the book. The idea of the open strategy is that you're not necessarily capturing the monetary value of these downstream applications, but you are capturing the innovation which is being provided by this community of downstream applications. You release a model, you release the weights of it, in Meta's case, and you allow this community of volunteers to basically go and play with it, to improve it, to make context windows larger, to make inference run cheaper. All of these improvements made by the community for no payment. Those improvements can then be rolled back into Meta's model that they use internally. So basically here, they're trying to capture this distributed innovation network. It's not necessarily about that sort of direct monetary impact, although they end up saving lots of money from it, but instead about capturing that innovation more generally. So in each of these cases, you've got these four different strategies, and I think they lead to different interests in how the AI world develops, different interests in regulation, for instance, but also different interests in terms of whether things continue to improve, whether things are opening up to open source models, or whether there continues to be a focus on these proprietary models. All of these different strategies have different interests, which end up partly explaining a lot of the behavior of these companies.
You describe a dramatic shift within big tech in 2024, where these firms moved from a position that was opposed to the military usage of their creations to one where they were very much open for business. By January 2025, Meta, OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google had all revised their AI principles, and many of them had contracts with military firms or the Pentagon. Can you walk us through this shift? Why did it happen, do you think? And what does this mean for wider geoeconomics?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating shift that goes on across the course of 2024. At the beginning of 2024, all of the major AI labs had explicit provisions that their AI technology couldn't be used for military purposes. It couldn't be used to harm individuals, and it couldn't be used for any sort of defense purpose. By January 2025, that had completely changed. All of these companies, Meta, OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, had explicitly revised their principles to allow for the military purpose. And a number of them, including OpenAI, Anthropic, and Meta, had all made new contracts with the defense sector in the US. And if it had just been one company, you might have sort of chalked that up to idiosyncratic elements of that company. But this sort of widespread, this broad shift in approach to the military use of this technology, I think really begs some sort of explanation. It begs for a structural explanation in particular. There's something underpinning all of this. And in my book, I try and explain what I think that is. I think there's two sort of key reasons. One is that for a company like OpenAI and Anthropic, this is a classic aspect of general purpose technologies. They require large amounts of investment. So something like the railroad networks back in the day, or telecoms infrastructure. They require this huge amount of investment. It doesn't necessarily pay off very quickly because, again, general purpose technologies take decades to sort of come to fruition. In the literature on general purpose technologies, it's a constant refrain that the defense sector is the place to go for funding, because the defense sector can just give out this money without having to worry about a return on investment in any sort of financial way. Their interests lie elsewhere. So I think it's not really any surprise that OpenAI and Anthropic eventually turned to the defense sector. I think it was almost inevitable given the scale of the investments and the necessity of finding funding. They have to turn to every source just to be able to survive. What's more sort of interesting, I think, is Meta and Google in particular. These companies have wings of their business which make huge amounts of money. They've got cash just flowing out of their businesses. They don't need to necessarily turn to the government to get to fund this investment. So there's something else going on here. And I think what it really has to do with is this return of geoeconomics, this sort of move away from what has been the neoliberal consensus about free trade in goods, services, and in data, really crucially. That idea that American interests are served through free trade is completely disappeared. And instead now we've got the rise of economic nationalism in various forms and the sort of the weaponization of supply chains and economics in order to fulfill particular geopolitical interests against what might be considered traditional economic interests. So this broader shift, which is going on within the tech sector, but also much more broadly, I think this is partly what helps explain this shift towards the military, getting rid of these bans on military usage and suddenly ponying up to them.
You're skeptical that we can explain the breakdown of the global world order by simply pointing to the rise of an emergent power, China, and its confrontation with the incumbent, the US. Can you talk us through why?
One of the common explanations for the emergence of this tension between America and China recently has to do with what's called Thucydides' trap. And this is an argument that comes from the scholar Graham Allinson. And his core sort of argument is that when you've got this dominant incumbent power in the international system, and you've got a new rising power coming up behind it, that inevitably, pretty much inevitably, there is some sort of conflict that emerges between these two countries as the international balance of power is being reset and the rising power is starting to take its new place. And for him, he looks at, America sort of in relative decline, and you've got China rapidly rising up the ranks in terms of any sort of power metric you might want to look at. And his argument is that it's inevitable that the US and China will run into tension, and very likely that they'll run into some sort of hot conflict at some point. Now, that's plausible, and it makes a lot of sense on a sort of surface level, and it sort of draws upon the intuitions of political realism and things like that. But the sociologist Ho-Fung Hung has really pointed out that it doesn't get the timing right. So there's long been, particularly within the US national security institutes, there's long been this concern about China. From 1990s onwards, a real worry that China was going to be this rising power and that the US should do everything it could to prevent that from happening. But that isn't what the US did. It wasn't until about the mid-2010s when the US started to change its policy towards China and started to take a more aggressive stance. And so Thucydides' trap, that argument, doesn't really explain the timing here. So this is where I think Ho-Fung Hung's argument about the sort of capitalist interest which lie behind these changes, I think is really important and really powerful. So for him, he points out that in the 1990s and in the 2000s, you had a very vocal sector of the US capitalist classes, particularly amongst manufacturing and amongst Wall Street, who were saying that we want the US to open up to China. We want to be able to have access to the cheap manufacturing provided by Chinese companies. We want to have access to this major new market to sell our goods to. And that was the push that opened up the US to China and reciprocally opened up China to the US as well. And this explains why the China hawks didn't win out across the 2000s, is that the capitalist interests were so powerful and so in favor of opening up to China that that's what ended up happening. This starts to change, though, over the course of the 2000s. And the US capitalist interests start to recognize that some of the promises that they believed about access to the Chinese market weren't coming to fruition. So, for instance, maybe the market wasn't as good. Maybe they were having to transfer a lot of technology in order to get access to the Chinese market. There was concerns about things like IP theft and various concerns around that. And basically, around 2010, you start to get the shift away from the US capitalist classes wanting to integrate with China to instead increasingly wanting some sort of protection from the emerging Chinese competitors, starting to see China not as a place that would be a benefit for them, but as a new capitalist threat for them. And this really continues throughout the 2010s. And it sort of starts with manufacturing, but then it starts to also take on the tech sector as well, I think, quite interestingly. So you can look at, for instance, competitors within the social media space, competitors within the e-commerce space, Temu and Shein, TikTok and ByteDance more broadly. All of these things start to compete with what were once the American dominant tech powers in the world. And so for the American capitalist interests, there becomes, this shift towards China. And once they start to shift their views on China, the China hawks in the national security sector of the American political elite finally are able to have their say. And so you start to see things like Obama's pivot to Asia, which starts moving military equipment away from the Middle East, which the war on terror had drawn in, and towards the Pacific region as a sort of a bulwark against the Chinese. So that starts in 2012. And then even under, sort of Obama, you start having investigations of Huawei, for instance. Huawei's in the news everywhere today. But that didn't start with Trump. That didn't even start with Biden. It was Obama who was the first one to implement this national security investigation of the company. And then Trump comes along in 2016 and really sort of ratchets it up the trade war. So launches all these tariffs, launches all these ways in which the traditional neoliberal order starts breaking down. You end up getting then this major shift in American policy, and it becomes not just sort of the expression of one idiosyncratic president, but instead a bipartisan consensus about what the US should be doing towards China, how they should approach this other country. Which is why when Biden comes along, he continues all of it. He doesn't ratchet things back at all. If anything, he ratchets up the trade war even more through a variety of new export controls on getting access to the latest semiconductors, getting access to semiconductor manufacturing equipment, getting access to the software that's needed to make this stuff. All of these things, America blocks China from getting access to. And then that gets continued, of course, with Trump 2.0. You've got tariffs raised to an absurd degree. You've got all sorts of new export controls being put in place. And yeah, over the course of 10, 15 years, you move away from the sort of period of neoliberal dominance, where dominant US capitalist interests saw it as in their benefit to open up to China, to now this period where loads of US capitalist interests no longer see a massive benefit in opening up to China in the same way that they once had. And China hawks are, of course, now having a major say in American policy and strategy as well. So it's a major, major shift which goes on. And it isn't something which happens overnight. It isn't something which happens with one president or one administration. It's something which takes course over a decade or more.